Hello, thank you for joining me at Bert's Books, where this time I will be embarking on my first ever Garbaugust, an opportunity I stupidly missed last year, but will hopefully be on course to get this out in time. Now, I'm sure many of you will only associate this channel with the highest quality of literature, and you may be asking yourself, what truck would Bert possibly have with garbage? Well, I think I've landed on a big one here. This book, its reputation as a piece of absolute slime, is commensurate only with its rarity value. And I was lucky to get a copy of this a couple of years ago for, I think I paid £3 or £4. I've seen it go for as much as 80. Now, come on, let's be honest. I have been known to deal with toilet books on this channel from time to time. This time, however, I believe the book is the toilet, if not the sewer. We are talking Pierce Nace's Eat Them Alive, 1977. You see the New English Library hallmark of quality there. Now, judging by the creature feature type of cover, you're not in for any sort of highbrow time with this, but even given the low standards this study in green might lead you to expect, the reality is that this book sinks lower, much lower. Now, you might say that the cover is the big giveaway that this book is going to concern itself with, big bugs, a vintage theme in sci-fi stroke horror that had enjoyed a recent boost at the time of this, thanks to the works of Guy N. Smith and so on. However, since the author is not very adept at the suspenseful build-up, this aspect of it is made painfully obvious on the first page, on which we find island-hopping nomad and a man with a distinctly troubled past, Dyke, yes, that's his Christian name, D-Y-K-E, not Deke, Dyke, Mellis. He's coasting around an island off the coast of Colombia when an earthquake hits. When the tidal wave subsides and Mellis realises that himself and his boat have miraculously survived, he looks inland to witness the quake's effect on the island. The tremors have opened up long-blocked underground passages and unloosed upon the unfortunate islanders a swarm of oversized praying mantises. Anyway, these proceed to dismember and gorge themselves on the unfortunate natives, a process that is described in garish detail here. While most men would be sickened by this spectacle, it seems to provide Mellis with the kind of kick he's not enjoyed in years. A supercharged jolt of pure sadism courses through his system, which has sublimated his long-vanished sex urges and any other forms of enjoyment. However, he's as appetising to these oversized critters as anybody else is. As he attempts to navigate away from the island, he realises that one particularly oversized specimen has clambered aboard his boat. Fortunately, the monster gets tangled up in Dyke's heavy-duty fishing net and is swiftly imprisoned by him to be carried off to his mainland base. Our protagonist is already beginning to speculate on these monsters' considerable potential as instruments of his revenge for deeds visited upon him some 10 years before. Flashback time. We're whisked back 10 years, back in the States. Dyke is this hoodlumish youngster, still in possession of a working set of tackle and running with the worst written set of hoodlums I think I've ever read. There's a gang of 5, their dominant member being Pete. To reinforce the fact that Pete's a black guy, he repeatedly addresses the rest of the crew as whiteys, even though one of them, Ryan, is a Native American. Pete is getting tired of the small-time hustles him and his crew have so far engaged in. He's got wind of something a little meatier. An acquaintance of his has mentioned a possible big score he might like to get a piece of. An eccentric old millionaire who doesn't trust banks much is holed in a large, secluded Texan ranch where he keeps a big wad of cash in his safe. Pete's buddy learned of this from a cellmate who's still got a few weeks to serve before he gets out, so they, in theory, can set out on this score together. It's a bad move telling this to a scumbag like Pete, who together with his crew jumps the gun on the informer and gets out there first. Successfully talking their way into the reclusive tycoon's home, they proceed to mutilate him. If they've got a fetish for unnecessary cruelty, this lot, before they bust into the safe, there's enough cash in there to set them all up for years. However, Dyke is already getting ideas about how much better he'd do if the whole stash was his. While the gang are settling down to sleep around the car with a view to dividing up the loot the following day, Dyke makes his move. Predictably, nobody was as sleepy as he'd hoped they were, and he's now at the mercy of a vengeful quartet of lowlifers whose predilection for sadism we've already witnessed. I say they kill him! Yeah! I say they cut his throat and then kill him! Yeah! I say they let him go! No! How about they cut his tackle off and then kill him? Yeah, but while they're sadistic, they are also a bit bloody inept, and they don't finish the job off properly. Dyke's mutilated form is rescued by some passing vaqueros or rancheros or whatever they are, cowboys, right? They nurse him back to health, and then for some reason they arrange passage for him down south of the border. So there we find him 10 years down the line, a joyless, solitary existence now given meaning by the prospect of vengeance which the big bug has crystallised. First, Melis is going to have to tame this thing as best he can. While he gets the creature used to the idea that he's the food bringer, first victims being jungle animals and then an indigenous local who's been caught thieving, Melis works up a method of ensuring that none of these beasties will want to bite him. This takes the form of a sticky paste, a combination of organic and chemical ingredients that's so obnoxious that Melis's new pet, now christened, God help us, Slayer, will turn his insecty nose up rather than chow down on Dyke's flesh. Having established his basic mastery of Slayer, the next stage of the plan unfolds. Dyke is to return to the island with Slayer in the hold as the newly appointed chief beast. The top of Slayer's head, incidentally, has been painted red to signify this. There's also going to be a batch of unwary mainland natives on board as enticing snacks. While the locals have heard news of this earthquake's effect, there's even rumours that the tremors have forced a new island to the ocean surface not far off. Note that for later. It's somehow relatively easy for Melis to talk them onto his pleasure cruise, even though he stinks like a shithouse with all that paste on him. On reaching the island, it becomes plain that having disposed of the local population, these oversized insects have now been chomping on each other to satisfy their appetites. The appearance of a bunch of hapless mainlanders is like all their Christmases coming at once, and they go to town on this new food supply. The process is described in obsessive, revolting detail. It's further embellished by a disturbingly misogynistic thread that these monsters have a particular thing about dismembering women, starting here first. These items are toyed with at length before being devoured, before the insects crack on with the rest of the still conscious victims. Melis seems to find this aspect particularly gratifying, perhaps a revolting redirection of his long debilitated sex urges. Protected by his sticky paste, Melis is able to quickly single out a particularly vicious batch of bugs as his private army, establishing Slayer as their red-topped sergeant major. He manages to cage them up and to shift them back to his mainland base, but he does get a bit of a nip himself, having forgotten that the seawater would have washed some of that stinky paste off his leg. The injury goes down to the bone. It does seem to heal without any specialised attention, as we don't really hear any more about it from here on. Having completed his intensive training schedule on his crack core of beasties, he's now ready to embark on his campaign of violence. Conveniently, chief victim Pete is likely to be situated in Colombia. Actually, the whole gang is. Having intimated his choice of relocation beyond the arm of US authorities to Melis back in the day, Dyke heads over to the town in question with a truck full of ravenous bugs and the well-trained Slayer riding shotgun. Even more conveniently, Pete, who's now made good with a wife, servants and a well-heeled sort of pad, is situated out of town, so beyond the earshot of any concerned neighbours. With this being Melis's number one revenge, it's played out in revoltingly gratuitous detail. Once Pete realises who he's dealing with, that he and his buddies inconceivably botched that killing 10 years ago. Pete's incapacitated and forced to witness the lingering dismemberment of loved ones and household members till he's a sobbing wreck, at which point he's served up to a slavering slayer. The remaining gang members are then dispatched along similar lines, the author ladling on the unpleasantness, gore, the breast-fixated misogynistic violence so repetitively and predictably it fast loses its shock value and just becomes pure padding. You really just want the author to get to the end of it. Last comes Native American hoodlum Ryan, whose gruesome end proves that he's no more impervious than the others to physical agony and the spectacle of entirely innocent loved ones being pulled apart in front of his eyes. As Melis hustles his insectoid murder squad off Ryan's property, he's momentarily distracted by a rustling in the bushes. Rather than he, or rather one of the Mantis squad, sniffing it out in pursuit, he shrugs it off as probably some wild animal or something. Note this detail for later. While Melis's worst instincts are rather than being satiated by his recent revenge orgy, they've now bloomed into full-blown megalomania. He's rudely jolted back to reality by an unexpected knock on the door from an even bigger, badder set of semi-tamed mantises, which decimate Melis's own bug squad in short order, leaving a battered Melis and Slayer holed up, all primed for some sort of Cassidy and Sundance last stand. How has this come to pass? Remember that other island? It turns out that one had a bigger, meaner strain of insects. Remember that rustling in the bushes? That was a relative of Ryan's, who's taking his cue from Melis, and he's headed off to that other island, hustled up his own Mantis army. So now what is left for Dyke and Slayer? Well, I don't want to, I hate to spoil the ending for it. I mean, you're kind of really beyond caring by that point in any case. So who was this mysterious Pierce Nace? You'd guess there'd have to be some pretty warped kind of individual to belch out this kind of crap. A mutant splice of Guy N. Smith and Sean Hudson with none of the redeeming qualities. Well, here's where it gets really weird. As far as anyone's been able to ascertain, the author was one Evelyn Pierce Nace, a part-time insurance secretary and a freelance columnist for various men's magazines, and even the local news in the small town of Pampa, Texas, where she's said to have been a local Bible school teacher. Even more curious is the fact that she would have been pushing 70 by the time this book was published. Her other writing credits, worryingly this wasn't her only book, include, would you believe, sex manuals, which is also puzzling since contrary to the genre's predilection for gratuitous, badly written sex scenes, there's none to be had. The thrills and spills are all about dismemberment. There's no side dish to that, although you could argue that in its relentless obsessive fixation with grisly detail, Eat Them Alive represents a sort of pornography of unpleasantness. Interestingly, there's no swearing in it either. These hard-bitten hoodlums verbally abuse each other with expressions like "you damn dummy" and similar. Maybe that's the churchgoer in Nace shining through. For someone who's said to have written to some degree professionally, this is an astonishingly bad book. It's almost unique in its artlessness. There's no build-up of tension, there's no ambiguity, there's no looming threat of the unseen, and hence there's no climatic payoff. To adapt a line from Garth Marenghi's balls-to-the-wall horror with no attention to craft or technique. The characterisation is one-dimensional, the characters within it are cut-out figures. Melis himself, a protagonist who's impossible to in any way empathise with or even marginally identify with. He's a broken record. His internal dialogues often take the form of a one-sided conversation with Slayer, who he imagines is somehow telepathically answering back to him. You really have to wonder at Nace's motivation in guffing this lot out, rather than believe the worst, that she must have to have qualified as some form of psychopath to have this kind of putrid mess bubbling away within her cerebral coils. To give her the benefit of the doubt, maybe this book was nothing more than a cynical exercise in hacking out a formulaic bug feature nasty to titillate the lower level horror audience's gross appetites. Though I do wonder whether we might read this as some sort of satire or critique of that audience in the formulaic kind of pulpy tosh that it tended to consume. Almost as if Nace was thinking, I know how nasty you boys are, see what you make of this mess. Anyway, if you're at all curious about this, I mean, I couldn't possibly in any conscience recommend you spend 80 quid on something like this. I think there might be an online or a talking book version. It's something you go to as a sort of a spectacle rather than any sort of literary experience, however kind of tolerant you might be to the grosser end of horror. Anyway, evidently it's too late for me. The perils of drunk online internet shopping. See you next time. Don't let the bugs bite.